The letter arrived on a Monday, sealed in an envelope so old that the paper crumbled at the edges. It bore no return address, only a single name scrawled across the front: Dr. Meredith Holloway. Inside was a map, not a modern one. This map was ancient, inked by hand on brittle parchment. It marked the location of a place that didn't exist on any satellite image or atlas: Blackwater Asylum. Below the map, a note read, "We've found it. Come quickly before it's too late. A.D. Dr. Holloway, a renowned psychiatrist turned paranormal researcher, had never heard of Blackwater Asylum. But the name of the sender, A.D., sent a shiver down her spine. Adrian Drake, her former mentor, had vanished 10 years ago while investigating the unspeakable horrors of Blackwater Asylum. Now, the impossible was calling her. Meredith followed the map deep into the Appalachian wilderness, where the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. The GPS gave out long before she reached the destination, leaving her to navigate by instinct and fading daylight. When she finally saw it, her breath hitched. Blackwater Asylum stood like a jagged wound in the landscape, its silhouette black against a blood-red sunset. The building was impossibly tall, its spires piercing the sky like claws. Its windows were shattered, its walls streaked with decay. Yet as Meredith approached, she felt the weight of eyes watching her from every dark corner. The heavy oak doors groaned as she pushed them open. Inside, the air was cold and thick, carrying the faint scent of mildew and iron. A single corridor stretched before her, lined with doors that creaked ominously in the faint breeze. "Dr. Holloway," a voice whispered, soft and brittle, from the end of the hall. She froze. No one had followed her. No one could have followed her. Meredith discovered a journal left behind by Adrian Drake in the asylum's archives. Its pages were filled with frantic scribbles detailing experiments performed on the asylum's patients. Experiments meant to open a doorway to something beyond human understanding. Drake's final entry read, "It watches from the abyss. It speaks in silence. I've made a terrible mistake." Suddenly, the door to the archives slammed shut. The lights flickered, plunging Meredith into near darkness. A low hum filled the air, a sound that seemed to come from the very walls. Shadows twisted and stretched unnaturally, their movements synchronized as though responding to some unseen command. Meredith ventured deeper into the asylum, drawn by the distant sound of voices. They were faint at first, like whispers on the wind, but grew louder as she descended a spiral staircase that spiraled far below ground level. At the bottom, she found a room unlike anything she'd ever seen. The walls were lined with mirrors that reflected not her, but the distorted faces of others, their mouths moving as though screaming, though no sound came. In the center of the room was a massive pulsating crack in the floor, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. "Help us," the reflections pleaded in unison, their eyes locking onto hers. The ground beneath her feet trembled as a deep, guttural growl resonated from the crack. Something was clawing its way through. The growling grew louder, accompanied by the sound of scraping metal. Meredith barely had time to react before a massive, clawed hand emerged from the crack, followed by an inhuman face, a thing of shifting shadows and glowing, vacant eyes. The creature spoke without words, its presence overwhelming her senses. "You opened the door. Now we are free." Adrian Drake's warnings echoed in her mind. The asylum had been a prison, and Drake's experiments had weakened its locks. Meredith's arrival had broken them entirely. Meredith ran, clutching the journal like a lifeline. The asylum came alive around her, doors slamming shut, walls shifting, the shadows themselves forming grasping hands. The whispers turned into screams, drowning out her thoughts. She reached the entrance only to find it sealed. Desperation drove her back to the archive, where she discovered a ritual scrawled in Drake's journal, a last-ditch effort to contain the abyss. But the ritual required a sacrifice. Meredith prepared the ritual, using the blood-stained relics left behind by the asylum's victims. The creature, now fully emerged from the abyss, descended upon her, its form massive and impossible to comprehend. "You cannot stop us," it said, its voice like grinding stone. "Watch me," Meredith replied. As the ritual neared completion, the creature lashed out, its claws raking through the air inches from her face. With the last words of the incantation, the room exploded with light. The creature let out an ear-piercing roar as it was pulled back into the crack, which sealed with a deafening boom. Meredith escaped Blackwater Asylum just before it collapsed into rubble, leaving no trace of its horrific history. She returned to civilization, but the experience haunted her. At night, she still heard whispers, soft and brittle, calling her name. And in the reflection of her mirror, a shadow moved where no shadow should be. It began with a single missing person. Elmsworth, a small, forgotten town nestled in the shadow of a dense forest known as the Silent Grove, had always been the kind of place where nothing happened. But when young Clara Haynes vanished without a trace on her way home from the local library, the town stirred from its long-held slumber. The search parties found nothing, not a footprint, not a shred of clothing. The only clue was Clara's abandoned bicycle at the edge of the Silent Grove. The locals whispered that the forest was cursed, a belief rooted in centuries of dark folklore. Tales of shadows that moved on their own, trees that seemed to breathe, and a silence so profound it drowned out all other sounds. But the legend everyone feared most was that of the Keeper, an ancient entity said to guard the forest, demanding sacrifices to maintain the town's fragile peace. 3 days after Clara's disappearance, a stranger arrived in Elmsworth. Dressed in a long black coat and carrying an old leather satchel, he introduced himself as Dr. Elias Grayson, a folklorist researching the Silent Grove. The townsfolk were wary. Outsiders rarely stayed long. Yet there was something about Elias, a quiet confidence, an unshakable curiosity, that intrigued them. He rented a room at the inn and began interviewing the locals, digging into the town's history and the strange occurrences tied to the forest. Elias quickly learned that Clara wasn't the first to disappear. Over the decades, others had vanished under eerily similar circumstances, their belongings always found near the Silent Grove. The pattern was undeniable. Elias couldn't resist the pull of the forest. Armed with a journal, a flashlight, and a small revolver, he ventured into the Silent Grove at dusk. The air grew colder with each step, the oppressive silence swallowing the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. The trees loomed overhead, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers. Hours passed, and Elias found nothing but an overwhelming sense of unease. As he prepared to turn back, he stumbled upon a clearing. At its center stood a stone altar, ancient and weathered, covered in strange, unrecognizable carvings. Resting atop the altar was a single item, Clara's library card. A low whisper rippled through the air, though no wind stirred. It wasn't a voice but a sensation, a pressure against his mind. Elias fled, clutching the card like a talisman. That night, Elias dreamed of Clara. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her eyes hollow and her lips moving soundlessly. Behind her, the shadows coalesced into a figure, tall, faceless, and cloaked in darkness. It raised a hand, pointing directly at him. Elias awoke, drenched in sweat. He knew he couldn't stop now. The town's survival, perhaps even his own, depended on uncovering the truth. But the deeper he dug, the more resistance he faced. The townsfolk, once helpful, grew hostile, warning him to leave. "Some things are better left buried," the innkeeper muttered darkly. Elias uncovered a chilling ritual detailed in an old diary belonging to one of the town's founders. The keeper demanded sacrifices every 50 years to prevent calamities from befalling Elmsworth. The sacrifices were chosen by the forest itself, marked by their proximity to the Silent Grove. Realizing the cycle was due to repeat, Elias pieced together the horrifying truth. Clara's disappearance was no accident. The town had knowingly allowed it to happen, fearing the wrath of the keeper if they intervened. Determined to save Clara, Elias returned to the forest, this time prepared for confrontation. The air seemed thicker, the shadows darker. As he approached the altar, he heard Clara's voice calling for help. The sound led him deeper into the forest, to an underground cavern hidden beneath the roots of an ancient tree. The cavern pulsed with a dim, otherworldly light. Clara was there, suspended in midair, her body encased in a cocoon of black tendrils. The keeper loomed nearby, its form shifting like smoke, its presence suffocating. "She is ours," the entity intoned, its voice reverberating in Elias's skull. "Leave or join her." Elias raised his revolver, firing into the mass. The bullets had no effect. Desperation clawed at him as he remembered the carvings on the altar. They weren't just symbols, they were instructions. With no time to lose, Elias replicated the carvings using a piece of sharp rock, etching them into the cavern floor. The keeper roared, its form flickering as the symbols began to glow. The tendrils holding Clara disintegrated, and she fell into Elias's arms. The cavern trembled, the walls cracking as the keeper's form unraveled. Elias and Clara fled, emerging into the forest just as the ground collapsed behind them. The silent grove seemed to sigh, its oppressive aura lifting. Clara had no memory of her time in the forest, but she was alive. Elmsworth, however, would never be the same. The townsfolk avoided Elias, their guilt too heavy to bear. He left soon after, his research incomplete, but his purpose fulfilled. Years later, rumors spread of strange occurrences in a distant town, whispers of a cursed forest and a faceless keeper. Elias knew the truth. Curses like these never truly die. They simply move, waiting for their next victim.